Hello, welcome to the very first Tael Talk of 2015. I'm Tael, and today I'd like to talk to you about a bit of a cult classic from the Nintendo Gamecube, Baten Kaitos, Eternal Wings and the Lost Ocean. Just so everyone knows, I am back. This will be happening every Saturday once again, just as before. And I've also launched a podcast series which you can find on SoundCloud. There is a link to it in the description below. And this podcast is a bit of a mixture of this gaming channel along with my animation channel and a few other things. So basically it's me and some other animators coming together every week to talk about either video games or online animation or movies or just whatever the topic of the week happens to be. So if you're into that sort of thing, be sure to check out my new podcast, Dreaming Of, once again in the link down below. And for now, let's get into Baten Kaitos, shall we? Okay, so Baten Kaitos was a JRPG. It was actually made exclusively for the Gamecube, and it was released in 2004 in North America, although if you're like me in Australia, it actually came out in 2005. And it was developed by Crescendo and Monolith Software and developed by Namco. Now, of course, Monolith Soft are now working on the new they've worked on Xenoblade and a few other things for the Wii, and they've got a new game, Xenoblade Chronicle, something coming out for the Wii U. It looks really, really good. This was originally published by Namco. It actually had a sequel published by Nintendo, which is a little interesting, but it was definitely one of the very few JRPGs that were released for the Gamecube. It's also a really unique JRPG from that particular generation. Something that is very important about this game, and this is something I will be going through on all my Gamecube reviews, is that this game does support progressive scan. So if you're in the United States or Canada, like I am, and you get a copy of this game, it is compatible with the component cables for the Gamecube. Now these are of course very, very expensive cables. They go up to $250 on eBay, but they make the game look absolutely phenomenal, and I cannot recommend playing this game enough with those particular cables, and that's what was used to capture this game footage. In fact, as far as I'm aware, from what I can tell from the videos I've seen, I'm the first person on YouTube to actually capture this game running in progressive scan. So Baten Kaitos itself, I owned this game when it originally came out on the Gamecube. I was in my late teens, early 20s, I think. I never got past the start of the second disc, but it's a game that I very much appreciated, because I grew up watching my best friend play Final Fantasy VII a lot, but I was always a Nintendo kid, so I never actually got to play any JRPGs like that. So this was really my first time owning something like that outside of Pokemon. And I will say this is actually the first JRPG outside of a Pokemon game that I have ever finished, thanks to this recording I did for this video. So let's get right into it, shall we? So the first thing that you'll notice about this game is it looks absolutely beautiful, and there's a couple of reasons for this. First of all, it has these beautifully pre-rendered backgrounds. Some of these do have some small compression issues, but for the most part, they look absolutely beautiful with like some nice little animation and things. And I remember them blowing me away when I originally played it, and I didn't know how they would look today running on a big LCD TV, but they still look really, really nice, and I think it's really, really impressive. And as much as people poo-poo about pre-rendered artwork, I think it really does suit this game, and it works really, really well. The battle system, the backgrounds are a little bit more subdued, obviously, but it's full of really well-designed character models. They're visually interesting to look at. There's pretty particle effects going on everywhere when you're doing attacks. It's just a really good-looking game for the Gamecube. And from what I understand, the sequel looks even better. The game has a very generic save-the-world sort of story, as most JRPGs do, but it manages to make it genuinely interesting. The world that the game is set in has a really interesting history and feels like a very interesting universe, and it doesn't break its own rules, and that helps sell the story. And it also goes in some really interesting directions. There's some really unexpected things happen, so even though it starts off rather generic, and it does end really rather generically, everything in between sort of runs the gambit from being generic to like being incredibly creative, and it does subvert your expectations a little bit. And I don't want to go into detail about the story because, well, I don't want to ruin it for anyone who hasn't played this game, but it's definitely interesting, and it did definitely hold my attention and kept me playing through the 50 hours it took me to complete it. The game also has some really unique environments, the sort of environments you don't see in games very often, or at least I haven't. Some really interesting examples for me. There was a world that was all made up of like cutout, looked like paper. I don't know why the world is just like that. It was just something that they did. The game is full of these little areas which are just bizarre. And I absolutely love it. There's another area which is like a hall of mirrors, and it's actually quite a challenging little dungeon. And the game is just, full of these bizarre, strange environments that shouldn't work in anything, but for some reason in this game they work perfectly and suit it perfectly. And I really don't know what it is about this game that allows it to get away with these sort of things, but it just does. It's bizarre. Now, the game flows well, the story and everything has a really nice pace to it. It doesn't hang on any one particular thing for too long, up until the end of the game at least, which I'll get into. But it's a lot of JRPGs I feel are badly paced. It'll be, here's a chunk of story, now go fight a bunch of things, and here's another chunk of story, and they kind of, there's not a whole lot of storytelling through gameplay. Baten Kaitos isn't all that different from that. It still does its exposition before certain boss fights and things like that. But it's definitely, for some reason, the pacing of it feels really quick. Like a lot of the getting from point A to point B, a lot of it doesn't feel like a slog. You can get it done in half an hour between major plot points, and I like the speed that the game works at in that regard. I think that's really, really good. The game has a phenomenal soundtrack, absolutely brilliant. There's not a whole lot else out there like it. It runs the gambit in terms of styles, everything. Absolutely everything is represented in some way in this game's soundtrack, from cheesy butt rock to electro to classical to opera to just absolutely everything's in there. They threw in everything in the kitchen sink, and once again, it's one of those things where usually having so many different styles of music in one game wouldn't work. But just like the strange environments that make no sense, a lot of the music fits those environments perfectly, and it kind of makes something that shouldn't work a lot better than anyone would expect. And I really have nothing but the highest praise for I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce the name of the composer of this game, but he did a phenomenal job, and he also did a phenomenal job on the soundtrack to the sequel, which I have heard and very much enjoyed, even despite not having played the game. Of course, the big thing for this game, and the thing with all JRPGs that fans of JRPGs are into, is of course the combat system. I'm not an expert on combat systems in JRPGs. I don't play a lot of JRPGs, obviously. The combat system in this game, though, is based on a card system, so every character in your party has their own deck, and they all specialize in different things, like whether it be melee attacks, or range attacks, or magic attacks, or whatever. And basically, when you're in a battle, those decks get shuffled, and you get a certain amount of cards each turn, and you can do attacks based on those cards. And each card also has a number, so if you get a combination of ascending numbers in your deck, so that you play as an attack, that will actually do more damage than if you just use random numbers. And then you can throw in elemental stuff on top of that, and it is actually a really deep and complex combat system, and it's very refreshing. There's a lot of turn-based RPGs that are just select a thing and then watch the animation play out, and I think because the clock's always ticking on these two, you only get a certain amount of time to select your cards, and you really feel like panicky to try to get the best combination you can without accidentally selecting the wrong thing, which you do sometimes, and it adds a real layer of tension to some of the battles. It has its own fair share of problems, which I will be definitely getting into, but it's certainly a unique and, well, it's literally 10 years later, and it still feels incredibly fresh and unique, so I haven't really seen it attempted since. If you like the look of the footage of this combat system, then definitely check this game out. The game also doesn't have random battles, so if you don't want to be getting stuck fighting the same guys over and over again randomly, that's not an issue, although there will be times where you'll have to anyway, because the game does require some grinding. And lastly, I just want to say that the ending was actually really satisfying. Normally I wouldn't point something like this out, but I find most games that I've played in the last 10 years, I can have a lot of fun with them, but the endings are always underwhelming or leave me feeling a little flat. That wasn't the case with this game at all. The ending actually was quite uplifting, and while it didn't really have any surprises, it still managed to put a smile on my face, which is something that not a lot of games do, especially a 50-hour game. A game of this length would usually leave me feeling like I just done a bunch of chores basically, and like, yeah, it was finally over and done with, but the struggle to get to the end of this game definitely made the ending that little bit more satisfying. That said, the game isn't all roses and things. There are quite a lot of issues with this game, and I'm not afraid to say that. For example, there are some really bland boss battles, particularly the human bosses. There's a few of those, and a lot of them actually get repeated, and they're just not all that interesting. And they tend to be the longest fights in the game, actually. And it's just, when you're fighting giant monsters and stuff, and then it's like, here, fight a couple guys. It's a little underwhelming. Also, despite the fact that the creature designs are really, really interesting, you'll find that you're actually fighting the same creatures at the beginning of the game as you are at the end of the game, and they've simply recolored them, and they do this with the bosses as well. And that can make the battles feel longer and more repetitive than they actually should be. I really wish that they had a few more different creature designs that they would use throughout the game to make it feel a little more varied. There's also some really stupidly difficulty spikes with some of the bosses. I think there's a really notorious one when you've just gone onto the second disc, and literally once you've saved there, you can't go back to grind after you've crossed a certain point. You are stuck there, and if you don't know what's coming because it's your first playthrough, you're in for a world of hurt. I was underpowered when I got there. I did manage to get through eventually thanks to a couple of really good hands, but I had to fight this boss about 7 or 8 times, and each one of these attempts took about 30 minutes to 40 minutes, so that's something to be aware of. And sometimes, thanks to the random nature of the card battle system, as all card battle systems should be random, obviously, otherwise what's the point, the battle system can lead to times when you lose a major boss fight purely because you've had a couple of bad hands. So generally that's not an issue. There weren't that many bosses where that happened, and I didn't really run into it that many times aside from that boss in the middle and the end boss, but losing a battle because of a random factor is pretty damn frustrating, especially when you've been doing it for 40 minutes. And that means you have to go back, reset through a bunch of cutscenes, and then attempt it again. And the end boss is the worst for this. He takes forever to take down, and if you don't get the perfect hand, you are not going to win. 40 minutes is also a long time for a boss fight, so I would say some of the boss fights drag on far too long. And so you can see what my general complaints are coming from here. It's a lot of repetition, and there's a lot of long fights that just make the game feel like a bit more of a slog than it really should be. Getting away from the boss fights though, there are some other issues with the game. There are side quests, but they're all rather dull. The main one is just you going around collecting people's signatures on a family tree. It's not particularly rewarding or satisfying. I don't really know what the point of it is. I think you get some items sometimes from some of the characters when they sign it, but really it's kind of dumb and pointless. And there's also the issue of micromanaging every single character's deck. This can be incredibly time consuming. There's something like 6, 7 different characters that you have in your party, and you're micromanaging all of their decks all the time. So you spend a lot of time doing that, and swapping out cards is not the most thrilling thing in the world. I can tell you that much, and you'll be spending hours doing it throughout your entire playthrough. Another major issue with the game, and this is a real peeve of mine, and it's something I picked up on very, very quickly. The way the leveling up system works is you get experience points, and your character holds onto them, but you don't actually get to level up until you go to these blue flowers, which you use to save. But there's also the option to go to a church from there, and when you go to the church, you pray, and that allows you to level up, which is a really dumb, stupid system. But I can deal with that as long as there are enough blue flowers. Here's where it gets annoying. Before boss fights, there are red flowers, and they simply allow you to save. So see where I'm going with this? So if you've been grinding for, say, an hour, and you want to level up your character before you fight the boss, you actually have to backtrack to like another town or somewhere like that just to be able to level up, so you can fight your way back to the red flower again to fight the boss. And it just leads to a stupid amount of backtracking, and it's really, really frustrating. It's an incredibly poor design choice. I know it was removed for the sequel because they realized that it was a terrible design choice. I just don't know whose idea that was or why they did that. Saving at the blue flowers, that's fine, that makes sense. It's a limitation of the RPG genre. You can't just save anywhere generally. But making you go to them to level up, it's just not smart. There's also some really obtuse progression choices. So when you're progressing through the game, sometimes you'll find yourself not knowing what the hell to do, which is another staple of the JRPG genre, I suppose. Not everything is always spelled out for you, and I don't think that's a bad thing necessarily. But when the solutions to these issues are as obtuse as some of these are, that's a bad thing. So an example of this would be one that really pissed me off, where in order to progress in the story, you need to get a cookie for a kid. And in order to get this kid, you need to backtrack to a certain town, and then in that town you need to go to the Queen's castle, and in that castle you need to go into the Queen's bedroom and look through a vase to get a seed, which turns into a flower, which you then give to a baker to turn into the cookie. It's a long process, and I don't know how people are supposed to work that shit out on their own. It's very much that old idea of just walk around and click the A button on everything until you can progress sort of game design, and it's really it's not fun, and it's a really common theme throughout the game. So I will say there were a few times where I did have to use a play guide to actually work out what to do next, and usually it was because there was something really dumb and obtuse that needed to be done. The last 4 to 5 hours of the game are an absolute slog. You will fight the same boss 5 times, and then you'll have to fight this other boss in 2 different forms back to back, and it's a long time. It is a long and tedious ending to the game, and it's annoying because the pacing up until that point is brisk and fast, and you're always moving forward, and then you hit that part of the game and it just stalls. And it's really kind of sad that that happens just before the ending. It's a good thing that the ending of the game is as good as it is, otherwise that would destroy the entire experience, or at least it would have done it for me. Also, there's voice acting in the game. I actually turned it off. And I turned it off because it's atrocious. And if the bad voice acting wasn't bad enough, there's also this filter over the top of it, which makes everything sound really tinny and whiny. It's just, with such a phenomenal music, you would think the voice acting would hopefully complement it, but it really doesn't. It actually destroys the music. So if you're playing this, definitely turn the voice acting off and just just read the text in your head. It makes for a much better experience. And lastly, my last complaint is if you're interested in exploration, this game has next to none of it. I guess that's the downside of pre-rendered backgrounds. You can only do so much. But it's not a major thing for me. I kind of just like beelined it through the story anyway, so if you're like me and you're just in it for the story, it's fine. But if you are someone who likes to find nooks and crannies, they are there, but there's not many of them. So I guess in closing, despite the fact that I sound like I have a lot of negative things to say about the game, and obviously I did, I actually think the game is really good, and it's almost great, despite all of those issues. It's just the core of it is so good that you can get past all of these things. It's definitely worth its cult status. Here's the thing though, if you don't already own a copy, copies on eBay usually go for about $35 and upward for a complete and boxed manual copy. I'm collecting Gamecube games actually, and you'll see a lot more Gamecube reviews this year actually. Part of that's because I do have the progressive scan cables and I'm going to be the only person out there reviewing games in progressive scan. But the other part is I am trying to get a complete Gamecube set, and I find playing a lot of these games interesting. But the game also has a sequel, which I've never played because it was never released in Australia, and it's called Baten Kaitos Origins, and it actually goes for, usually they start around $50 plus, $10 shipping, so it's a much more expensive and less common game. But definitely the first one is worth checking out for. If you have a Gamecube and you're looking for something different, or you enjoy JRPGs or card-based battle systems in particular, Baten Kaitos is a great game to add to your collection, and despite all the negative things I had to say about it, I think it is a fantastic game, and it is definitely worth checking out for fans of the genre. What about you? Have you played Baten Kaitos, or have you got any other particular JRPGs for the GameCube that you're a fan of? Perhaps Skies of Arcadia? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to have a chat about it, and I'm always looking for new games to add to my collection, so if you know of any, let me know in the comments below. This has been Tael, and thank you for joining me for the first Tael Talk of 2015. I know it was a long one, but it's a big game. So thank you again, and I'll catch you next time.